A new day means new conspiracies. Y'all, we are back at it again, reacting to theories on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube that are going to make us question reality, question everything, rethink life, etc., etc., etc. Let's go ahead and watch some of the gems that you guys dropped in today's video. I dropped this video in the chat.
Indiana mom dies after drinking 4 16-ounce bottles of water in 20 minutes.
How does that happen? How does someone die from drinking too much water?
Right.
So let's break it down very simply as to what happened to this woman. She's on the beach with her family and it's the middle of summer and she's likely pouring sweat. She told her husband that she felt really dehydrated, and like most people, she began to drink water to help feel better. And it wasn't that she drank water, is that she drank too much water in too short of a time. You see, our kidneys can only excrete a certain amount of fluid at one time. Our bodies naturally have a certain amount of salt or sodium in our bloodstream, and in water, you have 0 salt. So if someone consumes fluid that has no sodium, it gets diluted into the bloodstream and our sodium levels drop. And if that happens, our brain can actually swell. Think of our brain cells like these little Orbeez water beads. They get too much water in a short period of time, they can actually swell. It's called osmotic demyelination, and it can cause confusion, seizures, and in rare cases, death. That's most likely what happened in this case, so how can we avoid that? If you are feeling dehydrated, it is best to consume water slowly over a period of time. And even better, it's best to consume fluids that are more isotonic. That means fluids that have electrolytes in them, such as Gatorade or Powerade. Most importantly, if you are out in the hot weather, just make sure you consume fluids consistently to prevent dehydration.
Crazy how what you need can also take you out if you have too much of it.
I think one thing too that like I just showed some people in my life that they didn't know about is the click 5 times on your iPhone's power button.
I didn't know that. What does it do? What does it do?
Okay, you guys. So this is like, I'm constantly scared about getting kidnapped. Like I will talk about this throughout the episode, but like getting kidnapped is my biggest fear. So if you have an iPhone, and I'll try to like screen record and just zoom on the screen or whatever, but if you have an iPhone and you click the power button 5 times, it goes into like an emergency response system. So it looks like this.
And she gonna do
and
it?
It says like emergency SOS. And then it immediately, if you let it go and you don't like press cancel like I just did, it automatically calls emergency services and you can set up your emergency people and it'll automatically send them a message that you need help and it'll send them your location where you're at.
Wow.
The more you know. That's helpful.
You think you know somebody, right? But you don't really know them until you meet their family because it makes the person that you're in a relationship with make sense. If that makes
sense.
Like I've never spent an extended period of time with your parents. Like we go out to eat, we go home. Like I was with them for 6 days, and then I started to get
I'll start in reverse order. Why now? Well, I've been trying for 3 years to do this interview. The U.S. government prevented me from doing it by spying on my text messages and leaking them to the New York Times. And that spooked the Russian government into canceling the interview. So I've been trying to do this, but my country's intel services were working against me illegally, and that enraged me because I'm an American citizen. I'm 54, I pay my taxes, I obey the law. And there was no expectation in the America that I grew up in that my government and its intel services, NSA and CIA, which were always outwardly focused on our foreign enemies, would be turned inward against American citizens. And I'm shocked by that, and I'm infuriated by that. And so once I discovered that that was happening, and I confirmed it was happening, and they admitted that they did it, then I was totally determined, monomaniacally dedicated to doing this interview, not simply because I want to know what Vladimir Putin is like and what he thinks about a war that is resetting the world and really gravely damaging my country's economy, but also because they told me I couldn't on the basis of illegitimate means and for no really clearly stated justification. And I thought that can't stand. I want to live in a free country. I was born in one. And I'm going to do whatever small thing I can do to maintain, the society that I love.
You are known to be pro-Republican. Party, right wing of Republican Party. This is what they claim. They said first you've been a Democrat,
That's not
and
true.
became a Republican. Okay. Or you are known to be pro-Trump, anti-Biden. What is truthful in this? And you went to Putin because you are pro-Trump and anti-Biden?
I mean, my views are not very interesting. I'm not sure how I would characterize them. They're changing as quickly as the world itself is changing. And as a matter of principle, I think that, that your views should change when the evidence changes, and assumptions that you had in the past are proven wrong. That has happened to me virtually every month of my life. If you pay close enough attention, you can rate your own performance, just as if you're betting on sports. I lost that one. And when you do, when it turns out that the things you thought were true were lies, you should admit it. So what are my views? I'm not certain. Tell the truth is my main view, and I plan to do that to the best of my ability. So Trump played no role in this whatsoever. There's obviously an election in my country coming to fruition in November. I have no idea what's going to happen. I think that the current administration is very obviously incompetent, and the president is senile. That's not an attack. Everyone knows it. It has now been confirmed, I would say, this week in the report that you're all familiar with. But and that's very sad. But it had sort of nothing to do with the interview. I wanted to interview Putin because he's the leader of a country that the U.S. government is sort of at war with, though not in a declared way.
Sir, you know your President Biden well.
Yes, I do.
You've been working in several media organizations, from PBS, CNBC, MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, and you've been covering this field well, and you know the American politicians. And now you've been following Putin, and you did a very lengthy interview with this gentleman. And for sure, to interview them, you did your homework and you did your research. Comparing the culture, the competence between Vladimir Putin and Biden, how do you see the two men now running the world?
I mean, if this were boxing, the fight would be called by the medic. And I say that as an American, and I don't have another passport. I don't plan to ever leave my country. My family's been there hundreds of years, and I love it. I am a patriotic American. And I grieve when I see that the president is non compos mentis, and that in my country, it is considered very rude to say that. And you sort of wonder, how did you get to a place where you have an incompetent president who's driven not simply the standard of living, but life expectancy downward, and no one feels free to say that? That's not a political observation. It's a statement of fact, which is provable empirically. And the most radicalizing thing I would just say for me in the 8 days I spent in Moscow was not simply the leader of the country, who of course is impressive. It's the largest landmass in the world. And it's wildly diverse, linguistically, culturally, religiously. It's hard to run a country like that for 24 years, whether you like it or not. So an incapable person couldn't do that. He is very capable, and many of you know him, and you know that. What was radicalizing, very shocking and very disturbing for me was the city of Moscow, where I'd never been, the biggest city in Europe, 13 million people. And it is so much nicer than any city in my country. I had no idea. My father spent a lot of time there in the 80s when he worked for the US government and barely had electricity. And now it is so much cleaner and safer and prettier aesthetically. Its architecture, its food, its service, than any country, city in the United States that you have to, and this is non-ideological. How did that happen? How did that happen? And at a certain point, I don't think the average person cares as much about abstractions as about the concrete reality of his life. And if you can't use your subway, for example, as many people are afraid to in New York City because it's too dangerous, you have to sort of wonder, isn't that the ultimate measure of leadership? And that's true, by the way. It's radicalizing for an American to go to Moscow. I didn't know that, I've learned it this week. To Singapore, to Tokyo, to Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Because these cities, no matter how we're told they're run and on what principles they're run, are wonderful places to live. That don't have rampant inflation, where you're not going to get raped.
Sir, excuse me.
What is that?
Excuse me. Are you anti-American model?
No, I am the most pro-American. So I'm 54. I was born in 1969. I grew up in a country that had cities like Moscow and Abu Dhabi and Dubai and Singapore and Tokyo. And we no longer have them. And what I have discovered is that's a voluntary choice. as inflation is, as you heard in that fascinating last panel, inflation is the product of choices made mostly by the central bank, not exclusively, but by policymakers. Crime, same. You don't have to have crime, actually. If you don't my children don't smoke marijuana at the breakfast table. Why? Because I won't allow them. It's very simple. It's a short conversation. No. And you can run your country the same way. We're not going to put up with that, so don't do it. And people understand that. Filth, graffiti, Paris, one of my favorite cities, New York, one of my favorite cities, are filthy. And part of the reason they're filthy is because people spray paint obscenities on buildings and no one cleans it up. So that encourages more people to do the same. And our policymakers, for some reason, don't notice this. London, another one of my favorite cities. You see English girls begging for drugs on the sidewalk. And I thought to myself, if I'm Boris Johnson, who briefly and very badly ran that country, I would ask myself, like, wait a second, my countrymen are begging for drugs on the street. Maybe I should do something about that. But no, he'll show up and give some speech about Ukraine and how we need to send, more cluster bombs to the brave Ukrainians. What are you doing?
You mentioned Ukraine. By talking to this gentleman, President Putin, for this lengthy interview, my question is, did you had coffee with him? Did you have any off-the-record discussion before the interview?
After.
Did you feel during the interview or before or after that this man can make or is willing to do a historical compromise, number one, on the status of the world with the West, and number two, about Ukraine? Is he a compromiser, yes or no?
Of course, right? I mean, the leaders of every country on the planet, other than maybe the United States during the unipolar period, are forced by the nature of their jobs to compromise. Compromise is part of it. That's what diplomacy is. And he's among those. His position is clearly hardening. Russia has been rebuffed by the West. I mean, Vladimir Putin, I'm not flacking for Putin. I'm an American. I'm not going to live in Russia. I don't love Vladimir Putin. I'm stating the facts. He asked Bill Clinton to join NATO. He tried to make a missile deal.
He mentioned this in the interview.
He did, that's correct. And he's mentioned it in other forums as well. And NATO said, no, we don't want you. Now, the point of NATO, originally, of course, the post-war goal of NATO was to keep the Russians, the Soviets, from coming into Western Europe. It was a bulwark against the Russians. So if the Russians asked you to join the alliance, that would suggest you have solved the problem and you can move on to do something constructive with your life. But we refused. And so, I mean, just meditate on that. Go sit in the sauna for an hour and think about what that means.
Before sitting in the sauna, a question now. Final conclusion, you think that Vladimir Putin is eager for a compromise,
Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have a perfectly adequate show for you today. That's what Ryan Grimm always used to say when he would introduce the show.
That feels like a
with
Grimmism.
That characteristic deadpan. I miss the guy sometimes. But glad to be joined by you,
thanks.
Brianna.
I'm always going to be down for some Grimm love. He was the person who first hired me out of a legal profession and into this wonderful profession that we're in currently as a journalist. So love me or hate me, you can blame Ryan Grimm.
Well, we hear from a lot of people on both those sentiments regularly. What are we talking about today?
Well, up first, even Biden-friendly media outlets are having trouble covering up the fact that the president just isn't that popular. NBC's Meet the Press seemed in shock that voters trust Trump to handle the economy better than Biden by a whopping 22-point margin. Take a look.
The issues that are driving this, too, the economy, no surprise, we've been talking about it, but look at that advantage for Trump, 22 points. Wow. And securing the border here, folks, a very important Trump with a 35-point advantage.
The economy is so striking, Steve, because jobs are up, inflation is down. Voters aren't giving him credit for that, clearly.
Yeah, there are a couple areas in here, I think, where Democrats see potential opportunities to grow Biden's support. Certainly, they are hoping the economy, folks change their perceptions of it and start rewarding Biden for it. That's what they're hoping, certainly.
The Meet the Press segment highlighted some other bad polling for Biden coming from NBC News. Per the poll, Biden's job rating is the lowest of his presidency and the lowest for any president in an NBC poll since Bush Jr.'s second term, while 48% of voters say that Trump will do a better job at being competent and effective than Biden at just 32%. 538's polling average has Biden drowning at nearly negative 17% disapproval. For comparison, Trump was at around negative 10% at this point in his term.
One such reason for the precipitous drop in Biden's approval are ongoing concerns surrounding Biden's mental fitness for the job. Now, during a recent campaign stop, Biden referenced a meeting he had with Mitterrand from Germany after being elected. One small problem, actually a couple small problems. Mitterrand was the French president, and he died in 1996. Take a look.
People have pled guilty. You know, Right after I was elected, I went to what they call a G7 meeting, all the NATO leaders. And it was in the south of England. And I sat down and I said, "America's back." And Mitterrand from France looked at me and said, "You know, why? How long are you back for?"
Compounding concerns of Biden's mental health failures seem to be his unwillingness to do interviews. As Variety reports, President Joe Biden will not take part in an exchange during the pregame festivities leading up to the CBS broadcast of the next Super Bowl on February 11th. CBS News confirmed. Now, this will mark the second year in a row that President Biden has turned down the opportunity, which typically draws an audience of tens of millions, even in the hours before kickoff. President Biden also declined to speak to a news correspondent from Fox News Channel last year. That clip is really bad. I actually had to, I wanted to check that it wasn't digitally altered because it was so bad.
Yeah.
No, it's genuine. He's deeply confused in the way that I think anyone who watches that is going to think of if our grandparents or great-grandparents, past a certain point in their life. That is clearly an association Americans are having with President Biden, and something they are signaling over and over again that they are simply not comfortable with, that they are not okay with. I saw Nate Silver point this out on X the other day, saying that this is if you talk to people outside the media bubble, outside very reliably Democratic or progressive circles, you will hear from just ordinary Americans that they are so concerned about this problem. Democrats, people who voted for Biden last time. It is not being taken with nearly as much seriousness, given that sentiment existing out there everywhere.
I 100% agree. From the start, from the 2020 primary onward, the DNC, the Democratic Party, made it very clear that this was a taboo subject. No one was to discuss the fact that Joe Biden was a historically old president, and not just that he was historically old, but that the gaffe-prone guy that made it through the Obama administration was morphing into something other than someone who makes oopsie-daisy errors on the basis of him just being a human being, but into this other realm that is frankly very uncomfortable to watch, both from a health and cognitive perspective. The part of what I think has hurt Democrats from really taking this issue seriously is there has been some bad faith harping on smaller issues that could just be gaffes, and there is a focus on, could he make it up the runway? He tripped here or there. Okay, fine. But there has throughout been also a more substantive cognitive argument to be made. And I remember back in 2020 during the primaries when Castro had the audacity to mention on stage that Joe Biden seemed to have forgotten what he had just said moments before. He and Cory Booker both came back into the spin room and made comments about whether or not Biden was cognitively fit. And I swear we have not heard from either of them since that moment. There's not a single pundit who seriously grapples with this issue or has been grappled with this issue over the course of the last 3 years. Dean Phillips, bless his heart, has made an effort to make a candidacy basically on the premise that he can be Joe Biden but younger, and he's dismissed for that. And liberal pundits say, well, if you're just Joe Biden but younger, why would we want you? Because they don't see the but younger part as really crucial to the decision making that voters have to make when they go to the ballot.
Right. And they can think that if liberal pundits want to be on TV and try to explain to Americans why this is not a legitimate concern, fine. But it is a concern. People are definitely concerned about it. It's the only thing that can explain some of these poll numbers. Trusting Biden 22 points more, trusting Trump 22 points more than Biden on the economy, even though there has been some improvement in terms of inflation, in terms of jobs, in terms of economic prospects, that, is some kind of silver lining maybe for Biden. But people don't trust him on it, and it has to be the age component. Biden is running for re-election on approval numbers as low as George W. Bush at his lowest. And George W. Bush wasn't running for re-election then. Because that would have been insane to think that he could have possibly gotten a third term if it was legally prohibited. Obviously,